Sarah, a talented young photographer, was used to working alone in her small studio. She found inspiration in solitude, enjoying the freedom that came with her profession. Her studio was in a quiet neighborhood in a country town, and the peace of everyday life was something she deeply valued. However, this tranquility was about to be shaken in a terrible way. It was a gloomy autumn night, and the rain fell incessantly outside. She was focused on her work, editing photos from a recent portrait session. The hours flew by, and she barely noticed the world outside getting darker. It was that night that Sarah began to feel a chill run down her spine, an uncomfortable sensation that could not be ignored. She paused her work and looked around, her eyes settling on the shadows dancing on the walls. An uneasiness came over her, and the tranquility of her study seemed to have turned into an oppressive prison. The phone rang, breaking the silence that had settled in. Sarah sighed in relief that she had something to distract her from the feeling of restlessness that enveloped her. She picked up the phone and answered it, expecting to hear the voice of a friend or client. However, what she heard made her freeze. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted and whispery, an ominous presence that seemed to seep into his soul. "I'm always watching you, Sarah," the voice said, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. She tried to respond, but the words fled her mind. Who could be making this frightening threat? Was it some kind of tasteless prank? The silence that followed on the call only increased the feeling of discomfort that enveloped her. In the days that followed, the threats continued. Sarah began receiving disturbing text messages on her phone, all from the same distorted voice that had called her. The messages contained personal details about his life that no one else could know. Photos she had taken the previous week appeared on her phone, each with threatening messages attached. She couldn't believe what was happening, feeling more and more like she was in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The feeling of being constantly watched began to dominate Sarah's life. She could no longer concentrate on her work, constantly looking over her shoulder and suspicious of every sound. The night became a torment, and she could barely sleep, her mind tormented by the threats that haunted her. Sarah began to isolate herself from friends and family, unable to trust anyone around her. She installed security systems in her small apartment, thinking it might bring some relief to her growing paranoia. However, the stalker's oppressive presence seemed impossible to escape. Security cameras installed in his apartment captured nothing out of the ordinary, and police were equally frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence to track down the culprit. The threatening messages continued to arrive, becoming increasingly disturbing and personal. Sarah felt helpless, a sick victim of the unknown stalker who seemed to know everything about her. She lost weight, nights of sleep, and her peace of mind, all consumed by the fear that haunted her relentlessly. Sarah's story was just beginning, and she was determined to discover the stalker's identity and end the nightmare that had trapped her. However, the answers she would find would be more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. Sarah was convinced that the threats and terrifying messages she was receiving were more than just a bad prank call. She could no longer ignore the fact that she was being stalked by someone with sinister intentions. Determined to put an end to the nightmare, she made a courageous decision, reporting the threats to the police. So Sarah went to the local police station with her messages and evidence in hand. Investigators initially seemed skeptical about the seriousness of the situation. They questioned her thoroughly and, despite her tears and harrowing accounts, expressed doubts about the veracity of her allegations. Investigator Carol Simmons, however, seemed more empathetic and willing to help. She resumed the case and promised Sarah that she would do her best to solve the mystery. Police began tracking the messages, trying to determine their origin. The messages were sent from anonymous phone numbers and unidentified internet routers, which made the task even more challenging. As the investigation continued, Sarah lived each day in a state of increasing paranoia. She felt like the stalker was always watching her, waiting in the shadows. She installed security systems in her small apartment. However, the recorded images only revealed the empty view of an empty space. Police also monitored Sarah's communications, but the threats persisted. The messages continued to appear on her phone, increasingly disturbing and personal. The stalker seemed to know everything about his life, from his deepest fears to the places he regularly frequented. Sarah's paranoia continued to grow. She felt constantly watched and began to question the loyalty of everyone around her. She isolated herself from friends and family, unable to fully trust anyone. The feeling of being trapped in your own nightmare only got worse with time. As police continued to investigate, Sarah found herself increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress. She felt powerless in the face of the threats that consumed her and began to doubt that the police would ever solve the case. The nights were the worst, when the darkness brought out his deepest fears. The stalker, in turn, always seemed to be one step ahead. He sent a message to Sarah on a stormy night, when the wind was howling outside and the rain was beating against the windows. The message read, "You can't escape, Sarah. I'm everywhere." In a fit of panic, Sarah locked all the doors and windows in her apartment and called the police. When police arrived, they searched the area, but the stalker was gone. There were no physical clues, no trace of his presence. The police were as perplexed as Sarah, and the feeling of helplessness that gripped her only increased. The stalker was not just an observer, but also a sinister predator who haunted her in her own home. Sarah felt like trapped prey, afraid of every sound and shadow. She realized that if she wanted to put an end to her nightmare, she would have to discover the identity of the stalker and what motivated him to pursue her on her own. Sarah's determination led her to delve deeper into a mystery that grew more sinister by the day. The answers she sought would be more terrifying than she had ever imagined, and the confrontation with the stalker was quickly approaching. Sarah was determined to find answers and end the nightmare that had plagued her for so long. However, the police seemed powerless in the face of the stalker, who continued to evade all attempts at identification. She knew she had to act on her own. She began investigating the messages and threats thoroughly, revisiting all the evidence for clues. However, the stalker always seemed one step ahead, leaving few clues behind. Sarah also began researching similar cases in hopes of finding patterns that could help her discover the stalker's identity. It was during this personal investigation that she made a chilling discovery. While examining one of the photos she had received from the stalker, she noticed a fuzzy reflection in a mirror that was not supposed to contain any figures. The reflection showed a hooded man holding a phone. The discovery left her in shock, but it also gave her a tangible clue. She immediately consulted a technology expert, hoping to track down the phone number from which the threats were sent. With the help of this expert, they discovered that the number was linked to a location close to their apartment. Sarah passed this information on to the police, who finally had something concrete to investigate. However, the process was still time-consuming, and the stalker continued to torment her. The nightmare was far from over. On a stormy night, with winds howling outside and rain beating against the windows, Sarah left her apartment to buy groceries at a nearby grocery store. She was nervous, but believed the police were making progress in the investigation. However, what happened on his way to the store would change everything. As she turned the corner of the building, Sarah came face to face with a hooded man, standing silently in the rain. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. The man looked at her with cold, empty eyes, and then said in a sinister tone, "You can't escape, Sarah. I'm everywhere." Sarah screamed and ran back to her apartment, locking herself inside in fear. She called the police immediately, but the time it took for them to arrive seemed like an eternity. When the police finally arrived, the hooded man had disappeared once again. They searched the area but found no trace of the stalker. Investigator Carol Simmons was concerned about the situation. She feared that the stalker might be getting closer to crossing the line between virtual stalking and physical threat. Police redoubled their efforts to discover the identity of the hooded man, but clues continued to be scarce. From that moment on, Sarah lived in constant fear. She didn't feel safe anywhere, with the feeling that the stalker could be watching her at any moment. The lack of control over the situation and the uncertainty regarding the stalker's identity made his life unbearable. Sarah's story was far from reaching a conclusion, but she was determined to no longer be a powerless victim. She knew she needed to discover the stalker's identity and put an end to this nightmare. As the investigation continued, Sarah prepared for a sinister confrontation with the hooded man who was relentlessly tormenting her. The confrontation with the hooded man had thrown Sarah into a state of constant vigilance and fear. She could no longer ignore the gravity of the situation. The stalker was not just an observer, but a predator that got closer and closer. She was determined to uncover the identity of the man behind the hood. even if it took her to the limit of her courage. Sarah continued her personal investigations, determined to unravel the stalker's mystery. She revisited all the messages and evidence, looking for any clue that might point her in the right direction. However, the stalker was meticulous about keeping his trail hidden, and clues were scarce. While researching similar cases, Sarah began to notice that the stalker seemed to have a pattern. He chose moments of vulnerability, like rainy nights, to terrorize her. She noticed that the messages often referenced places she had recently been or events in her personal life. It was as if the stalker was constantly one step ahead, watching her closely. The most disturbing revelation, however, came when she looked again at one of the photos she'd received. It was then that he saw the diffuse reflection of the hooded man in a mirror. She looked for details that might provide a clue, but there was little to be found. Determined to find out more, Sarah consulted a technology expert who could track the phone number from which the messages were being sent. Together, they have made significant progress. They discovered that the number was linked to a location near their apartment, an abandoned office building that had become the epicenter of the stalker's activities. She passed this information on to the police, who finally had something concrete to investigate. Meanwhile, the stalker continued to threaten her, making it clear that he would not give up easily. He was aware that she was getting closer to the truth, and that made him even more dangerous. Police mounted an operation to investigate the abandoned commercial building. When they entered the site, they found a dark and desolate space, filled with debris and traces of recent activity. However, the stalker had disappeared once again. There were no physical clues that could lead to his identification. Investigator Carol Simmons was frustrated but determined not to let the stalker escape again. She redoubled the police's efforts to solve the case, aware that time was running out and that Sarah was in danger. The following night, the stalker sent another message. "I know you're looking for me, Sarah. You're getting closer and closer, but you'll never catch me." The threat was more personal than ever, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She was determined not to let the stalker escape again. Although haunted by fear, Sarah decided to return to the abandoned office building on her own. She knew she was taking a risk, but she couldn't wait for the police to solve the case. That night, with the rain beating on the windows and the wind howling outside, Sarah entered the dark and desolate building. She walked carefully through the empty hallways, feeling like she was being watched at every step. The fear was palpable, but her determination drove her forward. While exploring the building, she found a dark and mysterious room on the top floor. There, he found a computer and a phone, which was still connected to the internet. The lights blinked, indicating they were in use. Sarah knew she was close to discovering the stalker's identity. She quickly copied all the data from the computer and found messages, photos, and documents that linked the stalker to various sinister activities. However, time was of the essence, and she felt that she was not alone in the room. The stalker was close. Before she could react, the hooded man emerged from the shadows, revealing his face. It was someone Sarah knew, someone she had never suspected. The look in the stalker's eyes was crazed, and he approached slowly, whispering, "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah. Now you'll never escape." Sarah was trapped. She looked at the stalker's face and saw the insanity in his eyes. The sinister confrontation she so feared had arrived. Now, everything was at stake, and the stalker's revelation would shed light on a dark mystery that had tormented her for so long.